This is the New Jersey opening, popularized by Robert Durkin and Ted Dunst in 1957. It's also known as the sodium. White's plan is to control c4 and b5 for reasons which are not entirely clear. Our best continuation is probably e5. We should immediately attack this poorly placed knight on a3. And White in this game plays d4. In this aggressive variation, White is deliberately trying to get his queen into the center. We could avoid that by simply capturing the knight and then perhaps playing e4, but in fact White's exposed queen will become a weakness. So we'll just bring that queen out into the center there. And now White's hoping that we capture his knight. However, after bishop takes a3, queen takes g7, threatening our rook, queen f6, queen takes f6, knight recaptures, b takes a3, White's actually up a pawn, as you can see here. Bishop takes, queen f6, queen takes, knight f6, and b takes a3. White's up a pawn. This is not good for black at all. So what we really want to do here is first block that queen with knight f6, and now White really should probably play knight b5 and then maybe eventually try to play queen f4, putting pressure on c7. Regardless, black's position is going to be slightly better. What he actually plays is queen d3, and the idea here is he's still hoping we take the knight on a3. I suppose that's actually a big point of the sodium opening, is he's really hoping, or White's really hoping we take the knight, but because once the queen gets on a3, it's going to be a little bit difficult for us to castle, but it's not really going to be that difficult. Our position's totally fine here. But the best move is d5. We can just develop normally, occupying the center, opening lines for the bishops, and of course note that by occupying d5, we're also preventing White from moving his knight to c4. He continues to develop with knight to f3, probably still hoping we take the knight on a3. But here we can actually mock him a little bit. We can play knight to a6. Our target here is the White's queen on d3. We could have played knight bd7, but it seems more thematic to mimic White's knight. And whereas his piece is poorly placed, aimed at c4, which we control, our piece is well placed, poses a legitimate threat to play to both c5 and b4. Of course, what we really want is to play knight c5, because that would then prevent White from moving to queen b3. White tries to stop us from playing to c5. He's pretty desperate there to really kill our knight if we move to c5, but really what he probably should have done is focused on his light bishop that's stuck on f1 behind all those pieces. He could have played g3 followed by bishop g2 to try and get that piece into the game, because he really can't stop our plan. In fact, we're not going to immediately play knight c5, not because of his bishop, but simply because we'll just wait for a while and maximize our positional advantage, see what he does, and then we'll make a decision later about what exactly we're going to play. So by playing c6, we gain flexibility. We can play knight to c7 if we want. We can play queen to a5 if we want. And we'll just wait to see what he does. He castles queenside. Once again, both knight c5 and knight b4 are playable, but we continue to develop with bishop e7. And there he plays c4. What he really should have done is move the king to safety on b1. And in fact, this is exactly why we delay our own attacks, because we hope to provoke our opponent into making additional mistakes. And here, White is being overly aggressive, hoping to utilize his pressure along the d file. He is in particular hoping for d takes c4, queen takes d8 check, bishop recaptures, and then knight takes c4. As you can see here, d takes c4, queen takes, bishop recaptures, and knight takes c4, which is, it's still a good position for black, but right here we actually have a much better move, a decisive Zwischenzug, which you might want to pause it and think about if you can't see it. But knight b4 is really winning right there, because there's no way White's going to be able to defend this a2 pawn successfully, although he certainly tries with queen b3. And you might want to ask yourself, what's so great about black's position here? we haven't won any material, so what's the correct continuation for black? It's A5. Now at this point, white's best move is probably to take our pawn on D5. However, we can then advance A4, attacking white's queen, and then white can save the queen by moving to C4. After we can then play B5, and white's queen will have to move again, probably to D4, which will let our knight capture on A2. But even better, after queen D4, we have yet another Zwischenzug playing bishop F5, which will prevent white's queen from moving, or will prevent white's king from moving to B1. Look at that a little bit here. C takes D5, A4, queen has to move, B5 attacking the queen again, queen has to move again. There's bishop to F5, and you can see how white's king's really getting smothered there. At this point, white cannot continue with his original plan, which is to take the pawn on C6, because we have a forced checkmate. Knight takes A2 check, king D2, bishop B4 checkmate. As seen here, D takes the pawn, knight takes check, king to D2, and there's bishop B4 checkmate. So white really recognizes here the threat posed by our knight, and what he tries to do is to intimidate us by attacking our knight with bishop D2, probably hoping that we retreat back to A6, but of course by moving the bishop he's taken the defense away from the pawn on F2, which we can now attack then with our other knight, knight G4, and white could now take our knight on B4, but that's really not a problem. We can just recapture with A takes B4, and that actually attacks his knight on A3. So there's no real advantage for him to gain from taking our knight. Instead, he tries to open up the center here to accomplish something there, but we just continue by forking the rooks, let him take another pawn there, and we can attack his queen. So he has to move his queen, and now we recapture the pawn on C6. And what white really wants to do here is take that knight on B4, but if he plays bishop takes B4, we actually have queen to D1 checkmate. So what he tries instead is knight G5, trying to gain something with an attack on F7, but we can defend easily enough by castling. And then he pulls the knight back to E4, hoping of course that we capture on E4, but instead we take the rook on D1, king recaptures. Now we can actually attack the queen again with bishop E6. After the queen moves, we can take the pawn, once again attacking the queen, which now moves to E5. And here we really just want to, trade as much material as we can to win the endgame. So we play queen to B8, attacking the pawn and the queen. And white maybe could have tried to hold on to his queen, but there's no real point. Trades the material off. That pawn on B2 is going to die, and then he plays bishop to G5. And what he really wants here is for us to take the bishop so that his knight can recapture and then attack our light bishop on E6. However, we can maximize our advantage some more with actually two Zwischenzugs. First rook F8 check, king moves, and now F6, gaining some space in the center. The knight or the bishop then retreats, and rook takes the pawn, and there the bishop comes to C5, where now white wants us to take his dark bishop so that his knight can recapture, and it'll actually fork our light bishop and the pawn on A4. And then I suppose if we were to say play bishop to B3 trying to defend our pawn on A4, his knight could take our light bishop, but I mean it's any variations really winning for black at this point. But here maybe this is a good move. We play it's pretty aggressive knight C3. If he takes our dark bishop, attacking our rook on D8, we can play rook D1 check, and then when his king moves to F2, we can play knight takes E4 check. On the other hand, if he takes our knight on C3, we can capture his bishop on C5. Of course, his knight could then take our pawn on A4. And so a good question is, can you see how his knight's actually going to be trapped? Actually, both of his knights are going to be trapped on the edge of the board. Knight takes 3-3. Bishop takes C5, knight takes a4, and this looks kind of problematic because if we take his knight on a3, he'll take our rook on b2, and if we defend our bishop or move our bishop, he'll still take our rook. But once again, we have a Zwischenzug with bishop b4 check. King has to move to f2, and of course we still can't take the knight because our rook's under attack, but now we can play rook a2, and both knights have been trapped. If white tries to save the one on a4 via knight b6, we have bishop c5 check, which forks the knight and the king. And if he tries to save the other knight via knight b1, we can simply capture the knight on a4. Meanwhile, the knight on b1 will remain trapped, and so we'll be able to capture it as well. Let's look at that real quick. Knight b1, rook takes, and you can see how that knight really has nowhere to go. Doesn't really matter what white plays here. He played e4, and rook d1. Not only will be able to pick up the knight on b1, but in fact pins the bishop on f1 since the rook on h1 is undefended. So in this position, white recognizes that his knights are lost. He just tries to develop with g3. We take one knight, he develops the bishop on g2. We take the other knight, and he's got a pawn for two knights by playing there at c6. And we briefly check his king just to see where his king's going to go. And now we start putting pressure on the e2 pawn. He defends. And right here we just really want to trade bishops. If he doesn't take our bishop, we're going to take his in order to reduce material on the board. He does capture, we recapture. He defends the pawn, we put some pressure on the pawn, he defends the pawn some more. With f5, we're gaining space, controlling e4 and g4. His king now comes down. What he's hoping for here is to take f5 as compensation for e2. As you can see here, rook a takes e2, rook takes, rook recaptures, and king takes f5, which is mate in 10, so it's certainly winning for black. But we actually have a mate in 7 from this position, rook to e3, and you can see that his king really has not a lot of space to live in. His king takes our pawn, our other rook comes down, reducing his space even further. Right there he's trying to somehow get his rook into the game, but after g6 he's got real problems because king f6 is met by bishop e7 checkmate. So instead he plays king to g5, and now we can play rook e5 check again. Now his king comes to f6, and he's hoping here to get lucky and take our rook on e5, but we defend with rook a e4, and his king's completely trapped there. But our king is also trapped, and so he's actually one move from checkmate, but we have rook f5 checkmate right there, and that's the end of the game.